Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes till we get started. Please start letting us know in the chat where you're from. Welcome, Karen. Oh, wow. We've got people from all over. I see somebody from Africa, from Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Sudbury, Ontario, Las Vegas, Sri Lanka. Amy's from Virginia. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes so people can get logged on. Hi, Janet from Niagara. Hi, Star. All right. We've got Ellen from Philadelphia. We'll give people one more minute to log in. Hello, Soleil from San Diego and Philomena from Florida. All right. Hi, everyone. I'd like to get started. My name is Sandra, and I want to welcome you to our live cast today. Today's live cast is the last 8% conversation on empathetic leadership. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Institute for Health and Human Potential. IHHP, as we call it, is a research-based training company that has been at the forefront of teaching the essential skills of emotional intelligence for 25 years. We provide cutting-edge training to your people so they can manage their emotions, do what's difficult, and achieve great things together. What I'd like to help us get started today, I'm going to introduce our co-founder and president, Dr. J.P. Pawliw.
Hey, Sandra, thank you so much for that nice introduction. Great to be here.
JP is a New York Times bestselling author, a keynote speaker, and he also hosts the Last 8% Morning podcast, which is available on all platforms. He's also an EQ thought leader. And JP, I'm now going to pass over this live cast to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Sabine and the whole team for getting us set up. Great to be here. I'm so excited about today's session. This session today is part of the series on Last 8% conversations. And if Last 8% is something that's foreign to you, let me just explain what it is. Our research starting about 8 years ago found that there are different situations that we find where we struggle. It can come in the form of conversations or decisions or tasks. I'll tell you about conversations. Let's say Sandra and I are having a tough conversation about something important. I get to 85, 90, 92% of what I want to say to her. But when I get to that more difficult part, the last 8%, Sandra gets a sense of where this is going. She gets emotional. I get infected by her emotion. And as opposed to facing that last 8%, I back off, I avoid. And that's a challenge in today's environment where things are moving so fast. If we're not having those tough conversations, that's an issue. If people don't feel safe to have those conversations, that's an issue. But it's not just conversations, it's also decisions that we sometimes put off or tasks that we procrastinate on. So really excited to bring in a real expert today to help us with his really two parts. One is his expertise around human behavior to help us be better in these situations, but also to hear about his, personal experience with facing challenging situations. So our guest today is the author of 5 books, including We're All in This Together, which comes out in paperback in 2 weeks. He delivers keynotes and seminars to help people be more appreciative, authentic, and effective, something clearly we need today if we're going to keep great people in our organizations. And he's worked with a couple of organizations, really impacted them, a couple of organizations you might be aware of, Google, Microsoft, among many others. And so, kind of without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mike Robbins. Come on and join us. Great to be here with you, Mike. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. It's great to have you.
Well, you're welcome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm grateful everybody joined, and I know we had to adjust the schedule of this based on my schedule, so I'm just appreciative for everybody's flexibility.
Hey, listen, no worries. I want to ask you this. How does it feel like to be the antithesis or to do the opposite of Billy Beane? Now, for people, that might sound like an inside joke, but I wanted to explain it to people because there's going to be people who won't understand what I'm saying. But for everyone who doesn't know, Billy Beane was and is the general manager of the Oakland A's. And he's got an interesting history. And by the way, go watch the movie Moneyball, one of my favorite movies. Yeah. The book is fantastic. Michael Lewis, Moneyball, who lives in the Bay Area as well, wrote about how Billy Beane came in and brought a really innovative approach to baseball and teams. And maybe we'll talk about that. But the more interesting part of this story is that Billy Beane was this, really good baseball player back in the day, and he had a choice.
Yep.
Do I join the major leagues or do I take a college scholarship to play baseball and study at Stanford? And
yep.
As you know, Mike, and others on the call won't, Billy Beane chose to go the professional baseball route and missed Stanford. Yep. And I think rues it to this day.
Yeah.
And the connection here, of course, is Mike Robbins had the same choice. He could have chosen to go with the New York Yankees or choose to play and study at Stanford, and you did the opposite. And I almost think of that as a last 8% situation, a decision. Tell us about that, Mike.
Well, a couple things. I appreciate you asking. So I actually grew up in Oakland, huge Oakland A's fan.
Oh, wow.
So you're speaking my language. But yeah, so in 1992, I was a senior in high school, Skyline High School in Oakland, and I got drafted by the New York Yankees, which was a huge thrill, as you can imagine. I'd been, playing baseball since I was 7. I loved it. I was pretty good at it, but I had also committed to go play baseball in college at Stanford. And the way it works, you can get drafted out of high school, and then you have a choice. Like Billy Beane I think he got drafted by the New York Mets,
yep.
And he signed a contract. And once you do that, then you can't play in college anymore. And usually you don't end up going to college. You go right into professional baseball and try to make it to the major leagues. He unfortunately didn't make it.
Yeah.
Got there briefly, but didn't really, So I had a choice to make. And for me, it was a hard choice, but at some level, not the hardest choice because A, education was really important in my family. B, Stanford University is such an incredible school academically, but C, it's a really great baseball school. And
right.
So while there was some risk involved, I mean, if you sign a pro contract right out of high school in baseball at 18 years old, even if you're incredibly, incredibly talented, you're probably going to spend 3, 4, 5 years in the minor leagues anyway before you get to the major
right.
league. So the risk was, hey, go to Stanford you can get drafted again as a junior or a senior, and then, try to move on with your pro career that way. And so that's what I decided to do. And I loved my time at Stanford. I did end up getting drafted again by the Kansas City Royals after my junior year at Stanford. And I did sign a pro contract at that point.
Wow.
Went into the minor leagues, but got injured. I saw someone, as we were looking at where people are from, someone said they're from Lansing, Michigan. I actually played for the Lansing Lugnuts one year in the minor leagues back in 1996, but I ended up tearing ligaments in my elbow. I was a pitcher, and my career ended when I was still in the minor league. So in hindsight, it was really good that I did go to college and get a degree because it would have been harder if I had just signed right out of high school.
Yeah, and clearly, like you say, I mean, we're talking about, a great school academically and you went to the College World Series, which isn't so bad either. So,
Yeah.
but let's stay on this question just for a minute, because that was a decision, and yeah, it was a sports decision, but there's many people who are on this call who, with the Great Resignation, and maybe it's more the Great Migration, moving to where they really want to go, are facing career decisions. And so tell us a little bit about the decision in terms of, did you have like a dark night of the soul where you're like really not sure where to go, and what did you do to make that decision, and what might be helpful for people to hear as they make career decisions?
I would say the decision whether to go to college or sign professionally was a big one in my life. I mean, I was 18 years old. The bigger one, JP, that came up a couple years later. So my junior year at Stanford, we go to the College World Series. We have this incredible, we didn't win the national championship, but we got pretty close and had this incredible run. And I get drafted by the Royals that year. At the end of my junior year in college. I had an injury my freshman year, so I actually had 2 more years of eligibility. And so the question was, do I sign my pro contract at 21 after my junior year, or do I come back as a senior,
right,
and play with all my guys? Like, it was really hard decision.
Yes.
And I went back and forth, and I talked to my coach, and I talked to my parents, and I talked to all the people in my life who were important. And I ended up, it was like 3:00 in the morning, and I was sitting out at Sunken Diamond, the baseball field at Stanford University, by myself with my journal, looking up at the stars, asking for some divine intervention. And the truth was, the scary part for me was, I knew I wanted to play pro baseball, and I knew that was next for me.
Yeah.
What I didn't know is if I would succeed. And I was walking away from a community and a group of people and a coaching staff and an environment that I absolutely loved. And so I was scared to give that up.
Right.
What I finally decided was, I don't know what the future holds, and I don't know what's going to happen, but my lifelong dream has been to play in the major leagues, and I'm going to take the risk and do it anyway.
Yep.
Even though I'm walking away from something that is really important to me, and I'll miss out on senior year at Stanford with my buddies and playing and all of that. And so, it ended up being, I think, a good decision, but a hard one. And the truth is, like a lot of things in life, I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed in one more year and gone back. Yeah. We just can't know that. And I just finished actually reading Daniel Pink's book, The Power of Regret, which is fantastic. And I highly recommend it. And he talks a lot about how regrets are actually really important for us to look at. And some of his research shows that mostly we don't regret the stuff that we do. We just regret the stuff that we don't do, that we're too scared to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to underline that. I've read the book as well. Great book, great writer.
Yeah.
And for everyone, as you're making decisions, career or otherwise, that research finding is pretty consistent amongst the regret research, which is, it's the stuff we didn't do. It's not the stuff we did. And so I think that's a great reminder as we go through, whether inside an organization, in our personal lives, for us to keep in mind. But now, you're working with organizations all over the world. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, because we do have this great, resignation / migration. There are a lot of people who are really questioning, do I stay in this organization? Tell us what you're seeing right now and the future. And is this going to be a new normal, this real kind of fight for talent, or is it a short blip? I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
I mean, I think there's a couple factors. I think the first thing, JP, I'm seeing, people are exhausted right now. I mean, just everywhere I turn, everyone that I'm talking to, I mean, even with a little bit of renewed energy, I mean, look, the new year started and Omicron, everybody got COVID, it seemed like, and companies had opened and then closed. And then we make it through that to some degree. And now things are looking better on the COVID front. And it's like the war in Ukraine, or just the 2 years, the cumulative effect of all of the stress and, quite frankly, trauma that we've all been through. Yeah. I say that because I just think it's really important to realize that, like, I mean, I've been saying jokingly, but not so jokingly for the last year, like, I don't think any of us are playing with a full deck right now, because this has been hard. So I think that's important to remember. And part of what I think this migration or this resignation is a couple factors. One, I think it's the exhaustion, the monotony, the boredom, the like looking for something else. The second part, the practical reality is, we're all, with all of the twists and turns, and right now, some market instability and all that, the economy and the job market has been pretty darn good and solid in most industries and sectors through this time. So what's also opened up is now that everyone basically worked from home for at least a certain amount of time, everyone realizes, A, I can do that as an individual, and B, the companies realize, oh, we can hire people from anywhere in the world.
Right.
So that's just opened things up in a way that now employees have a lot of leverage and power right now, which is both a good thing.
Yeah.
But for companies, most of the leaders that I work with and talk to, they're scrambling and sort of freaked out about, oh my gosh, everyone seems to be leaving or wanting to leave. What are we going to do?
Right.
I do think some of this will naturally change, both because the job market is not going to stay this hot forever and the economy is not going to stay strong forever.
Right.
And I also think we still don't really know what the post-pandemic world looks like in terms of working virtually, working in person, all that. And I don't know that we're going to know that for like a while, right? Maybe another year or so until it starts to settle in more and companies really come up with not only what their policies are for working remotely, but also what actually works for the business and for the team.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. There's 2 points I want to kind of grab on there. One is we're not playing with a full deck. Maybe not exactly, but we are burnt out. We are compromised in some way internally. What are some of the things people can do when they're feeling overwhelmed to kind of build up their energy, build up their focus and momentum?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is just acknowledge that, not like an excuse or whining and complaining, but just acknowledge.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, how have you ever worked really hard for a long period of time and then sort of gotten used to being so exhausted, and then you had like a day off or a long weekend or a week off and you actually got some rest, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I was exhausted. Like I didn't even know I was exhausted. And then I finally got some rest. And so I kind of feel like it's that, like we're aware of it, but we're not fully aware of it. So I'm always advocating the more we can really acknowledge it and tell the truth about it, and then start to look at, is there a way, can I find any time in the course of the day or the week? Is it possible? Because the weird part about all this working virtually thing is like, I feel this too myself. It's like, why am I so tired? I didn't do anything today. I just got up and talked at my computer all day.
Yes.
I didn't dig a ditch. I didn't run a marathon. I didn't get on an airplane and fly anywhere. And it's like, but I think what's happening is like the cadence of our lives, even though we've gotten used to it, has gotten a little bit out of whack in a way that we didn't realize. So just finding some rhythms and ways. Can I take a little time off? Can I take a meeting instead of doing it on Zoom and do it on the phone and go for a walk?
Right.
Can I take a Monday off or a Friday off? Or, things that we always did in the normal pre-COVID time when we would get, but just try to build that into kind of our patterns and our cadences,
And it seems to me, this speaks to something else that I think you speak so well on, is not being afraid to admit that we're, challenged, to, some vulnerability. Speak to that if you could.
Yeah, I think it's so funny. The thing about vulnerability that we know is that most of us experience vulnerability within ourselves as weakness. It feels weak. It feels bad. It feels like I shouldn't say this. I shouldn't admit this. Mostly when we experience in another human, we experience it as courage.
Right.
The person who raises their hand and says, I don't understand that. Or, you know what? I need a break, or could someone help with this? Or I'm really struggling. We go, oh, wow, that's so courageous. They said that. Or that says, I actually don't agree. I know everyone's excited, but I don't agree with this or whatever. When we do that, the fear we have, and it's legit, is like, this could go badly. This could make me look bad. This could, people will judge me, criticize me. I'll fall flat on my face and make a fool of myself or whatever. And so the more we can get comfortable with taking those risks, with admitting those things, with asking those questions, what we start to do is not only for ourselves personally, we start to build the muscle of, oh, I can do that and still survive, right?
Yeah.
And we also create it more as a cultural norm. And for everyone who's watching or listening to us, if you're in a leadership position, and you're willing to do that, A, yes, it is more risky, but B, it can have more impact. Because when they say, oh, he admitted that he's having a hard time, or she admitted she didn't understand how that worked, or he was talking about this feeling of being overwhelmed or struggling at home while at work. Oh, okay, maybe it's okay for me to do that too.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And it almost brings up, it really goes to that second part, which is, and a big part of our conversation today, there's an even more reason why managers and leaders need to develop empathy, because people are struggling. Speak to that if you would.
Well, it's interesting because this book that I wrote most recently that you were talking about when you introduced me, We're All in This Together. I came out right as the pandemic was starting, and I didn't write it with the pandemic in mind, but people were using that phrase a lot, especially in the first few months. We're all in this together. We're all in this together, right? Which was weird to have just written a book with the title and they're like, did you know? And I was like, of course I didn't know. What are you talking about? It's a phrase I use in talking about teams and culture. But people then started asking me, are we really all in this together? And I actually found that to be a really hard question to answer, because I was hearing that in those early days, remember, of COVID, it was like layoffs and furloughs and lots of fear about business, right? We were in a very different place. And then here in the US and around the world, we were dealing with a lot that spring and that summer, particularly as it relates to injustice and diversity and equity inclusion, which is still such an important thing for us to talk about. But what became clear to me when I would get that question, JP, is I would kind of struggle, to be honest, to answer, well, yes and no. And because people are saying it looks like we're now seeing a lot of disparity and a lot of difference. And what became clear to me was that it's more like we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats, which is kind of always true. And when I say that or think of that metaphor, it's like, and the challenge is, yes, of course we have to focus on our own boat, because if we're sinking, we can't really do much of anything. But ultimately what leadership is about is trying to make sure we're getting as much water out of our own boat so we can float, but then picking our head up and looking around at what's going on in the boats of the people around me. And to your point, a lot of that's about is empathy. And one of the two things that make empathy really challenging these days, number one, in a virtual world, it's way harder to really have a sense of how people are doing.
Right.
Because all you see is they're on Zoom and they have their background and they have their thing, and then it's click to the next Zoom, to the next Zoom. But the second thing is, most of us are dealing with a bit of an empathy deficit right now, just because of how tired and exhausted we are. And it's not that we don't care, but it's like so much has happened to so many people. When you hear 15 intense stories of woe from people that are all very real, by the 15th one, it's not that you don't care as much as you did on the first one, but it's like, out of self-preservation, we start to kind of shut down a little bit emotionally.
Right. It really speaks to that first part we talked about. How do we maintain our energy and our robustness to be able to stay in there as a manager or leader? I'll say this. I like your description of kind of empathy in different boats, because I think what the pandemic has shone a light on is the inequity that we have in society, the inequality. I mean, that breaks my heart, to be honest, when I see, and by the way, I don't want to be too negative here, but some of the lack of empathy for the people who are in the front line of healthcare or retail. And this is a bigger structural issue we're not going to solve on this call, but boy, I feel like that's something that's really come out, that I think we have almost a responsibility to shine a light on, because, by the way, for all managers and leaders who are watching this right now, I think there is going to be a war for talent for a very long time. And if you create situations where people don't feel like they're being treated properly, their pay isn't fair, they have to get a second job, you're going to lose. Like, forget the reasons that I think we should be doing it, which are different, but just on the competitive side, speak to that if you would.
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, we know this, and we've known this long before COVID and the Great Resignation. We know that people don't quit their job, they quit their boss, right? Like, they leave mostly. Look, if they get a ton of money from somewhere else or some incredible opportunity, they could have the greatest manager in the world and they'll probably leave anyway. But most of the time, people leave because they don't feel valued, they don't feel appreciated, they don't feel cared about, they don't feel like someone, my manager, or has my back. I'm going to go. And in this virtual world too, it's harder to have those connections and feel that sense of loyalty and bond. And so it is really important to, be developing and nurturing the relationships as much as we can. And it is tricky. It's a tricky thing to do. And again, if we think about it from the standpoint, everybody who's a manager, a leader, is also a human being and has been
Right.
dealing with all of this as well. So it's like
Right.
when you talk about management or leadership, I mean, even when I'm working with the CEO and the executive team, it's like they're all people too. And even if they have a lot of privilege and they have a lot of positional power and they make a lot of money, there's also a ton of pressure and expectation that's placed on folks in those positions, not to
Right.
give anyone a pass, but a lot of what I try to focus on in my work, and when we talk about empathy, it's like, if we can kind of lower the waterline a little bit on the iceberg, is the metaphor I use when we're talking about vulnerability, what we start to see is this interesting paradox that on the surface, yes, we're all very different. And yes, to your point, there is inequity and there are lots of different things going on and dynamics at play, that some are structural and some are unconscious and some are very conscious. But
Right.
further down below the waterline we go on our iceberg, the more similar we become. And I've sat in rooms and on Zoom over the last couple of years with people from all over the world. I'm sure you have too, JP. I've been around in different places and different environments, and I love people. I'm fascinated by people. I'm constantly humbled by how much I don't know about people and cultures and different things. And at the end of the day, in 20 plus years of doing this work, when people really get real about their real experience, there's this beautiful thing that happens in response to genuine vulnerability. Is there's a natural empathetic response.
Yeah, the heart opens.
It does, because the truth is, you and I might, let's just say, but let's just say we're different. You're dealing with someone who's a different race, a different gender, a different age, a different skill set, a different role, a different background, a different way of looking, speaks a different, all that. All of those differences, which can make us feel more separate. Maybe someone's on halfway around the world and we're in different time zones and but the further down below the waterline we go, what we get down to is some pretty basic but important human emotions, right? It's joy, it's pain, it's excitement, it's sadness, it's gratitude, it's fear, it's all of, and then you realize like, oh, everybody's experiencing those things.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, your work is all about emotional intelligence. So it's really, can I get in touch with my own thoughts and feelings, and can I manage that to whatever degree? And can I then tap into the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences of other people and some way manage that and connect with that? And that's both, on the one hand, pretty basic, but on the other hand, as you and I both know, and everybody watching and listening, that's actually hard to do because human beings are complicated, right?
It is. You've had this, but some of the different groups we've worked with who are maybe in a really technical area, technical industry, could be Silicon Valley, could be U.S. Army, Navy, lots of engineers. In some ways, there's a manual, and it's very binary, this. But when it comes to the human side, there's no manual. It's hard. And the only way that we can get better is becoming students of human behavior, which is why I'm a fan, quite frankly, of your work. Now, one of the things that's critical, you said this, and it's, I think pretty well accepted now. People don't leave organizations, people leave their manager. What are some of the things a manager can do to, create that environment of, psychological safety or whatever it is, and I'd like you to speak to that, that will keep people, because I do think like that's where organizations will win or lose. If they can create this culture where people can feel safe, can take risks, can be part of an adventure, can be part of a culture that's really doing some great things, can dent the universe. I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Well, I think it starts with intention. Like as a manager, everybody listening, watching who's a manager, if what you want to do is have people feel safe, have people feel empowered, have people feel connected, engaged, all the things we want, right? It starts with just genuinely wanting those things and even letting them know, I want you to feel empowered. I want you to feel connected to me and the team. I want you to feel safe. It's both saying, but also demonstrating that you care about people. Now, the reality is we're going to like some people more than others. Some people are going to be easier for us to interact with. We're going to have similar interests or, communicate a similar way or have similar personality styles, or other people, it's going to be harder, right? That's part of managing. You manage multiple people. Some people are easier to manage. Some people are more challenging, but you can care about people and demonstrate that care by being curious, asking questions, finding out what they really need. Some people will need more engagement from you. Some people will need less. The same thing that could have me feel really supported might have someone else feel really annoyed. You have to know the difference, right? Yeah. Like I'm someone who likes when people ask me lots of questions and engage with me a lot. That makes me feel valued, appreciated, connected. Other people might find that to be intrusive or nosy. right? But that's an example of like, you just don't know until you ask or find out. So having not only those conversations initially, but in an ongoing way, checking in with people. And the biggest thing that managers can do that keeps people engaged is to appreciate them. And there's a difference. And I've done a lot of work and a lot of research around appreciation over the last couple of decades. And there's a really simple but important distinction, JP, that I've learned through some of this work is there's a difference between recognition and appreciation. Recognition is about performance. So it can be formal or informal, but it's a feedback mechanism. You did a good job on something. So either, hey, great job, way to go, or here's a bonus or some reward or some commission or some, there's lots of different ways to recognize people, but recognition is conditional. You have to earn it. Appreciation, on the other hand, is about people's value. It's about caring about them. So showing empathy is a way to appreciate someone. Listening to someone is a way to appreciate someone. Being curious about how they're doing. Just knowing some things about their life or their family, if they are willing to share with you. There's lots of ways to appreciate people that aren't about praising their performance. Because when we're only focused on recognition, what happens is then if someone doesn't perform well, what do we do? Okay, well, don't recognize them because they don't deserve it. But does that mean no appreciation? That means I care more about the people who are the top performers than not. Then we set up this really weird dynamic that makes things very conditional and hierarchical. And it's like, oh, there's the top performer and then there's everybody else. And that's not a way to set up an environment where people really feel safe.
I wonder, Mike, if it also enables, if we focus just on recognition, a risk-less, organization, because people don't want to be found out because then they're going to lose their recognition, their appreciation, they don't call it appreciation. But I wonder if that, it reminds me of kind of Carol Dweck's work around when you praise one thing, you will get more of that. So do you want to praise intelligence or do you want to praise hard work? Do you want to praise contingent? And again, there's a place for that. We all know that. But it's not the only answer, I think, is what I'm hearing you say, which sounds fascinating.
Totally. Well, and I'll give you an example. You brought up baseball earlier, but so again, some people watching or listening may not like baseball or pay attention or live in a part of the world where there's not much baseball. But the best example I have for the difference between these two and why they're important, JP, is I was a pitcher in baseball, right? And most people know, or maybe you don't know, some people don't, but when you don't do well as a pitcher in a baseball game, they literally stop the game and the manager walks out to the middle of the field and takes the ball from you, hands it to someone else who starts doing your job for you, and you have to leave, right? It's pretty embarrassing, especially if it was like the second inning and we're already losing 7-0. Then this was the worst part of the whole thing. I'd walk off the field, I'd go sit down on the bench and what's called the dugout, and the rest of my teammates would leave me alone and not talk to me. And not because they were mean or cruel or didn't like me, but because that was kind of the social, cultural norm.
Sure.
Oh, leave him alone, he's upset. Now, the truth was I was upset. Yes, if I gave up 7 runs in the second inning, got pulled out of the game, I was pretty upset. But what I really needed in those situations and almost never got was some genuine appreciation and care for me, not recognition. Because what are they going to say? Hey, Robbins, way to go, man. Great job, 7 runs. No, that's inauthentic, right? If someone fails miserably, we do not want to pretend like it was okay and sugarcoat it. No. That's why if we separate it out, don't recognize people unless they deserve it. But appreciate people all the time. Like if one of my teammates or my coaches could have come up to me in that moment and said, hey, man, that was rough, but you're an important part of this team.
Yeah.
And we got your back. Or even just gotten curious with me and said, hey, look, I know you might be upset, but is there anything you need right now or anything I could do to support you?
Yeah.
And then just let me respond. That's a great way to appreciate someone, is check in with them and say, I'm here for you. I want to support you. What could I do or not do right now that would be helpful? And I would have said, well, could you sit down and talk to me and hang out with me and try to help me not feel so terrible about myself? Where the next person might say, get the heck away from me. I just want to yell and scream and be mad. But in either case, that's a way that you can appreciate a human being when they fail or when they struggle, is by letting them know vulnerably, I care about you. I'm here for you, but I'm not going to try to fix it or solve it because I don't have the answer. I'm just going to support you.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that, Mike, and I really love, as Peter Taylor is saying, love the distinction between recognition and appreciation. What I really love about that is, there's a great transferability of that story. Yes, it's a sports story, but that story to work, to personal life.
Right.
And I think to myself, the number of times that people because they feel anxious, because there's a lot of emotions involved, they just want to like hightail it out of there. And that's not necessarily what people need.
No.
And so the courageous thing is, like you say, to step in and ask a question. Hey, how can I support you? That was a tough engagement with that client, or whatever the case.
Yes.
I'm here. Anything I can do. And the answer could be no, and the answer is yeah. Let's sit and talk about it. I mean, I think that's a real difference maker, because the way we see it, like these last 8% moments, those are moments that because they're high pressure, and there's a lot of cortisol in our brain, and cortisol, as you know, is a stress hormone, and it sears in memory. What happens is that whatever behavior as a manager we engage in, whatever decisions we make in that moment, get seared into the brain, because cortisol sears in this memory, gets seared into the brain of the person we're with,
Yes.
creating our reputation in their mind. And what's fascinating about that is it becomes, in my mind, that moment of either engagement or disengagement.
Totally.
And so many managers, and I'll say this, I think a lot of males especially, but maybe not entirely fair, but are so afraid to kind of enter into that they just avoid completely. And so people, they don't know how to read that. And so they take it as, don't feel appreciated, don't feel valued. And you know what? Maybe I will take that call from that recruiter. I think that's a critical moment, that if we're really all in this together, then it means we need to be a bit uncomfortable stepping in. By the way, I see this as well around things like somebody's lost a loved one. Yes. And sometimes we don't know what to do because we feel awkward.
Totally. And look, that's so big, because think of all the loss that's been experienced by so many people over the last 2 years. And this is something, I'm glad you brought that up, because something happened to me when I was an adolescent in that regard that was powerful. I had, and it was hard. It was a hard lesson to learn, but I learned it. My really good friend, Jarrett, his dad died suddenly. We were in 7th grade, and his dad died of a heart attack. And it was really scary, and it was sad. And his dad was this great guy, and he used to drive us to school, and he was around. And Jarrett's dad died, and we were all freaked out. And I hadn't, I was 12, 13 years old at the time. It was one of the first times I remembered someone's parent dying, and
Sure.
He was out of school for like a week. I don't remember exactly why, but I don't think I went to the funeral. But I remember he came back to school, and I was really worried about him, and I couldn't imagine what that must have felt like. And I had all these emotions I didn't know what to do with, and I'm a kid, and but I didn't know what to say to him, or I didn't know how to interact with him, and I kind of avoided him a little bit. But then when we interacted, I very consciously tried to be like friendly and happy, and like I didn't want to be weird or sad, because And then a couple days into him being back at school, he pulled me aside, and I'm so grateful that he did this. But he said, "Mike, you haven't said anything to me about my dad." And I was shocked and embarrassed, and I'm like flustered, and I said, "Well, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say."
Yes.
And then he said to me, I mean, this is another 13-year-old kid. He said, "You could have just said that." And I was,
yes.
And I remember in that moment of my own embarrassment and guilt and even shame that I felt right then, I remember thinking to myself, and here all these years later, it's like, I never forgot that. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that again. Like, I don't know what to say. Even if I feel really awkward and really uncomfortable, I'm going to at least say, I don't know what to say, but I'm thinking about you, and I'm, something.
Well, what's amazing, Mike, is that's a last 8% moment that gets seared into your brain, and you can remember it like that this many years later, number one. Number two, but that vulnerability that you speak about, to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. Like that alone for everyone listening is gold. Right. Because when people see us going, I'm struggling a little bit, again, their heart opens to us.
Totally.
And again, I feel like these are those moments that if we can just get a little bit better, and I think it's an internal struggle, I really do, because it's like we are just so programmed, this, to move away from things that are uncomfortable, move towards pleasure. Like it's just happening all the time, which is why I do think, a mindfulness practice is so important. Now, people think mindfulness is about a breathing exercise to calm your mind. It's not. It's actually a way to change your relationship to the moment, to not be like this, to just sit there. Yeah. And you said that in the very first part of our session today, of just like, can we just sit there and not leave and just stay when things are uncomfortable? I think that's really valuable. Let me ask you this: when you think of the book we're all in this together. Coming out in 2 weeks in paperback. That's so exciting. What would you say, what's the Cole's notes? If you could say, okay, listener, there's like 2 or 3 things. If you can just get this, that's going to make a big difference. I'd love to hear that.
I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, a lot of what we're talking about is the crux of it. Like, it is about that vulnerability and empathy piece. And this piece we're talking about it in terms of appreciation. It's also about really looking at, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, how do we create environments that are genuinely inclusive, where people feel like they belong?
Right.
And I did a little bit of research as I was looking at things about diversity and inclusion. And
I mean, your study at Stanford was in race, wasn't it?
It was actually, yeah. And here I am, white, straight, male,
yeah,
cisgendered, American. And I got my degree in American Studies with a specialization in race and ethnicity at Stanford. I grew up in Oakland, California, in a really diverse environment. And I was fascinated by race. And I actually, as a white kid growing up in my middle school and high school, there weren't a lot of white people. So I didn't realize.
Oakland and Palo Alto are 2 different things.
Yeah, it's almost, they're about an hour apart, but almost like 2 different worlds. And so then I go to college at Stanford, and like mostly everybody's white. And it was such an interesting juxtaposition for me to just experience that. And I say this because it's not directly about race as much as it's more about how do we find those places of common ground. And one of the things that I found that was so interesting, JP, to me, is I looked at Maslow's hierarchy. And while I'd been looking at that for years and talked about the hierarchy of needs, I didn't ever really realize, on Maslow's hierarchy, the pyramid, the 3rd one is the need to belong.
Yes.
It's a fundamental human need that we have. And it doesn't matter if we're male or female. It doesn't matter if we're gay or straight. It doesn't matter where we live in the world. It's just like there's this need within us to belong.
Yes.
And that's a heck of a lot easier said than done.
Yeah.
And so the challenge, I think, for all of us as leaders and just as human beings, it's like, are we creating environments where people really feel like they belong? And this notion of us being in it together, like I've always had this weird kind of naive question, but when I'm working with a team or there's conflict and people are, I'm always like, and I start hearing all the us and them language come out.
Right.
I always ask, who's the them?
Yes.
Like, I'm not familiar with and again, not to sound, but like, who's them?
Yes.
Aren't they us?
Yes.
And aren't we that, you know what I mean? And so that to me is sort of at the core of it. There's a friend of mine who's an activist who does a lot of work with all kinds of things happening around the world. And her big mantra is there's no such thing as other people's children.
Yeah.
And when she says that, it almost, even as I say it, I almost feel moved to tears because
I know
the babies are suffering somewhere. Can we do something, please? Because if those were my babies, right? I mean, we all have that instinctively in us to sort of protect the children. And I don't mean to get too sort of melodramatic about it, but I think the same thing when we're inside of our teams and our organizations. Yeah, people get on our nerves, and yeah, there's different agendas. And yeah, but most of the businesses that we're in, unless we are putting out fires or trying to save people or trying to come up with new technologies that's going to eradicate diseases, like most of the work that we're doing is not life or death.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I think sometimes remembering that is really important. Like, we're trying to create better products or services and sell them and make more profit and impact, right? But keeping things in perspective is super important.
Yeah. It's funny, Shelley is mentioning just that, this idea that asking people, is there anything you need right now? How can I support you? Is newish.
Yes.
And to society and to organizations. And I think that's right. I think it's, and it speaks to that this is a skill that a lot of people have the intention to execute, but don't know how. And it reminds me of, and you said this earlier, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but you made a great point. When people feel uncomfortable, what do? When there's great change in an organization and we're a manager and we see someone who seems to be resisting, we've got to really question that. Are they really resisting, or are they not sure what to do and afraid to ask? And so they go quiet. So we take that as, oh, they're resisting. They don't, and we get into our stories about, well, gosh, they resisted that. And no. Maybe they're just afraid to ask for help because, and so for all the managers and leaders out there, keep that in mind. Even to ask the question, to say, there's a not necessarily a great story, but someone in my family was going through what seemed like a tough time over Christmas 20 years ago. And they weren't being very nice to my mom. And my mom is like, she's like an angel on this earth. She is, like, really, she is certified, I'm sure of it. And I was mad. I'm like, well, why are you treating, mom that way? And of course, a month later, and I didn't ask anything. I just got mad at them and thought, well, gosh, you're like, what's going on? And are you mad I didn't invite you to the golf tournament? Right? I went through all the stories, personalizing it. A month later, I get a call. Hey, JP, my wife and I are breaking up, and whatever happened at Christmas had nothing to do with me, had nothing to do with my mom. And in some ways, I feel like I didn't lead through that time because I didn't ask that simple question, hey, is everything okay? You don't seem yourself.
Right.
You want to talk, or is there anything going on? Oh my gosh, I think now, honestly, Mike, in retrospect, I ruined Christmas, really. And so I think that's, for everyone listening, I think that's what, in our kind of language, that's, I think, what it means to be a last 8%er. Can we move in as opposed to move away? Can
Totally.
we, even if we're uncomfortable, can we still stay and not run? Because when we can, that's where gold lies. Building that relationship and everything else. Go ahead.
Well, and I think, what you're talking about in this whole concept, and I love it, of the last 8%, it makes me think of something. One of the core pillars in my book and in a lot of my work comes from a conversation I had with a mentor of mine years ago. And Karen just said, get comfortable with being uncomfortable in the chat, but here's what, Karen, you'll love this, because so my mentor says to me one day, Mike, you know what stands between you and the relationships you really want to have with people? And I said, what's that? He said, it's probably a 10-minute sweaty palm conversation you're too afraid to have.
Wow.
And
wow. Hold on. Just like, let's let that just sit there. Everyone, a 10-minute conversation. Sweaty palm, not comfortable, a 10-minute conversation. I think that's brilliant.
And he said, look, if you do like most of us and you avoid those conversations, you end up being a victim of who you work with, who you live with. He said, right. But if you lean into them, he said, here's what'll happen. You'll talk about the elephant in the room. You'll address the difficult subject sooner rather than later. You'll give feedback. You'll get feedback. You'll get to know people who are different. You'll check in with someone. And to your story earlier, you won't personalize things that aren't personal, right? You'll get to the root of what's really going on. And when I think about that, JP, look, the reality is sometimes they can be shorter than 10 minutes. Sometimes they can be longer. We know that. But the reality is, to your point, we get to that point of discomfort and we say, I don't want to say this. I don't want to ask this. Oh, they seem upset. This is too hard. This is a touchy subject, right? Oh, now we're talking about race. Oh, now we're talking about class. Oh, now we're talking about vaccines. Or now whatever the heck we're talking about, that it's like, we don't want to talk about it anymore because it's going to get weird or it's going to get polarized. And so we stop. Yeah. And then to your point, that 8% it needs to get addressed doesn't happen. Yeah. And neither of us are willing to go there. And not only do we not go there in the moment, we've now just made it 10 times harder to go there the next time. Yeah. Because we've trained ourselves and each other that, like, when it gets weird or when it gets hard, we're going to stop. Yeah. No, I think that's great. Thesali, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, has a great point, which is, we've got to have some intelligence around our emotions, which is also, and I think this is part of what you're saying, but we can also feel them and let them pass. Yes. They don't have to drive our behavior. So totally. I want everyone to hear this, right? Emotional intelligence is not about being nice. It's about being smart about emotions, being intelligent, being able to manage ours and the emotional environment around us without letting that drive things, but taking that as a really important currency and input into what's going on. Because it's also, like, as I'm a manager leader myself, and I struggle at times being a manager and leader, but I've got to make sure that I don't sit there and go, oh, I don't want, someone's upset, so I've got to cater to them, when really the vision of the organization and there's change going on, that just might mean that they will be not so happy for a decision, for a day, for a week. Like, that's okay too. Well, and I think, to your point, one of the things that I've learned about myself, and I've seen this, look, and again, it's been more challenging for me personally over COVID. So emotions ebb and flow. Emotions change like the weather. They're important. They're super important. But there are times I get really angry about something. And then if I give myself a little time and I work through it, I'm not so angry anymore. Right. There are times I'm really excited about something, and then a little time passes and I'm not as excited anymore. Yes. That said, dynamics like relational dynamics or dynamics of the business or unresolved conflicts, the emotional intensity may ebb and flow, but the dynamic itself usually doesn't magically just go away by us not dealing with it.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we get mixed messages about this. We've all been taught, like, take a breath, count to 10, sleep on it. And those can be good things to do, but that sometimes can be code for avoid it or don't deal with it.
I agree.
Right?
I agree. I think that's a great point, because I think, like you, but I'm a pretty naturally passionate person. And there are times on our senior team where I start off, I say, I just need to riff on this idea because something got me excited, and emotional or not. And so I think that's important. Let me ask you this, like, when you think of, you've come across some pretty interesting organizations and leaders. Can you think of a leader, we might call them a last 8% leader, someone who both has that heart and edge, that compassion, empathy, but also that, ability to do hard things?
Yeah.
Can you think of someone who comes into your mind, of like, I think that's a last 8% leader? I'd love to hear if you have one that just, kind of comes to mind.
The one that popped into my head is from actually quite a while ago. And this was a manager named William who, he worked at Wells Fargo. This was years back so we'd gone through the financial crisis. Wells and Wachovia merged. Wells bought Wachovia. I mean, two humongous banks with over 100,000 people each had come together, right? It was a massive, massive integration process. And on the heels of the recession, where the whole financial world had been flipped upside down, and all of us, because we all got impacted by it, right? But they were probably about 18 months into the integration. And I spoke at this event in Phoenix with a bunch of leaders. And the head of HR for this group says, I want you to meet William. He's been one of our best managers through this whole thing. He's really done a great job. His team is doing well. Their engagement scores are really, right? Yeah. And when I talked to this guy and was asking him, like, what have you done that's kept your team engaged and relatively healthy and through a lot of change and churn and all the stuff? And he said, Mike, look, honestly, I don't really know. I got lucky. I got some good people. He said, but there's one technique that I've used for years. And I used this one, and he's like, it came from one of the best managers I ever had when I was early in my career. He probably learned it in like a management 101 class. He's like, but I basically elicit feedback from my team all the time, and I ask them to do the same. And he goes, I use the 3 simple questions. What do you want me to start? What do you want me to stop?
Yeah.
What do you want me to continue? And he said, I do that. And he goes, and during this integration, I realized I had to double down on the feedback requests because everyone was freaking out in different ways, and they had lots of fears and lots of concerns. So the more that I could openly ask for them to give me feedback, and the more I could challenge them to ask me to give them feedback, it just kept sort of the pipes clean. So we weren't holding on to resentments, and people weren't making up stories and doing weird stuff. And he goes, I think that's helped keep our team as healthy as possible. Yeah. And I've been able to, as transparently as I can, communicate with them whatever I know. And if I didn't know stuff or I couldn't tell them stuff, I would say that. And when he said that to me, I just thought, gosh, that's so simple.
Yeah. Actionable too.
Actionable, right? But sometimes we overcomplicate things.
Right. I'll say this, Carrie makes a great point in the chat, kind of, and she wasn't saying it to your point, but I'll say, yeah, well and good, Mike. The part that matters, and I agree with what you're saying, but the part that matters for all of us is, are we willing to hear it, right? Yes. So it's like, I think for everyone listening, it's like, that's a great, actionable, simple tool, but you really got to be open to hearing that. Vulnerability is also to be open to feedback, about yourself, and not immediately try to explain it away. I think, it's like, these tools only work if we've worked on ourselves enough to be confident to hear it and to go, okay, it's not me as a human being, and it matters how people give feedback, but it's not me as a human being. It's something I'm doing, and I can do something about that. But will we be open to hearing that? I think Carrie makes a great point.
True.
About
it's really
that.
Important.
Yeah.
Carrie, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, look, taking feedback is probably as hard, if not harder, than giving it. They're both challenging for different reasons. But what I've seen over the course of my life and my experience and my research, JP, is that when we get feedback, there's 1 or 2 responses that we can have that are unproductive. And then there's a response that we can have that's really productive. And for me, I'll go through all 3 of them right in a row sometimes. a lot of times the initial reaction to feedback is a defensive one, like, hey, shut up. Hey, what do you say? Hey, we're trying to, right? And, or we could go into that self-critical place of, oh, I suck, right? So it's either shut up, like, don't say that to me, or how dare you, or who do you think you are? Or do you have any idea how hard or, oh no, I'm terrible, I'm bad, I screwed up, they hate me. Neither of those responses are productive. Often there's not a lot of maturity or awareness in them. They're just sort of knee-jerk reactions. They come from when we were much younger in life. But if we can get to the third response, which is the healthy one, which is, wait, what?
Yeah.
That's the curiosity. That's the growth mindset. That's the wait, what? Say that again? What'd you say? Huh? And then we try it on without taking it super personally, without getting defensive or self-critical. We consider the feedback. Maybe it's valuable. Maybe we can use it. Maybe not, but we're open to it. And we thank them. Thank you for having the courage to say that to me. Yeah. Because whether I agree with your feedback or actually do something about it or not, I want us to have the kind of relationship where you can tell the truth and you can say what's on your mind and know that I'm not going to freak out and overreact about it. And I'm going to consider it and maybe actually use it. Sometimes I'll get feedback, and my wife can attest to this, and I'll be a little defensive about it or a little self-critical about it, or maybe I'll pretend like I'm open to it, but it'll take a day or a week or a month, sometimes a year for me to come back around and go, you know what, babe, you were right. I thanks for saying that 17 times. I think I finally got it.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, I want to ask two more questions. One is, where can people hear more about you, buy your book, all of that? So we'll come back to that. But just before we do, kind of final question. And I want to thank everyone who's been on. I love the chat and all the little extras. And Mike, you're just awesome, of course. If you could sit here and give advice to your 17-year-old self, now that you've got some experience, some ups and downs, some learning, I hope, all of us, but some wisdom, what would you say to your 17-year-old self?
First thing I would say is, dude, relax. Just seriously. And it's funny because I hate when people say that to me, honestly, but I would say to him, listen, really trust yourself. This thing is going to get really exciting. There's going to be some ups and downs, but you have no idea what's coming, and it's better than you could possibly imagine. So if you could just relax and enjoy it more, it'll be way more fun, and you'll actually have more success that way too.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, 17-year-olds right now, the pressure to get into school, going through COVID, where, my kids are a little older than yours, but I just went through the whole college stress of applying, and oh my gosh, the stress of that was great. And so I think that's a great one. So, Mike, tell us, where can people learn more about your work?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. The best place is at our website, which is just mike-robbins.com. So it's MIKE-ROBBINS.com.
That's awesome. So Mike, I'm going to thank you for everyone. This is so valuable for us to get a little insight from someone who's really on the coal face, a great UK term of, the pressure and the stress that organizations are facing right now, and really appreciate you taking the time and sharing that with us. So thank you very much. I want to say to everyone else, this is part of that the series on Last 8% Conversations. So come back, join us again. I'm going to ask Sandra to come on to tell us about kind of what's next. But again, Mike, you're awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty. And Sandra, I think you're muted. That's okay.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for attending today. We will be sending out a recording of the live cast. It'll probably come out either Friday or Monday, and we will share links and some summaries of the conversation. I want to thank JP and Micah. It was a great conversation, and we hope to see you guys all on our next live cast. Take care. Thank you.